All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eric Skabinski, and we're thrilled to welcome you here to Fiscal Notes Live briefing on key themes shaping the 2026 legislative session. I'm sure most of you are here because you understand that action and change happens in the state houses. As many of you are likely to face unprecedented volume of bills and high stakes debates in upcoming sessions spanning budgets, healthcare, technology, finance, and the environment. We've designed today's session to help you focus on what matters most and where to engage first. So our plan over the next 45 to 50 minutes is that each of our experts will kick off one theme they believe will be important in 2026. And we'll compare notes on which states and policy areas require the most monitoring. And we'll close with practical intel and strategies you can use to stay ahead and influence outcomes. A couple of housekeeping items. Today's session is recorded and we'll share the replay and resources after the session. Please drop any questions using the Q&A panel and we'll tackle as many as we can in the time at the end. And please use the chat to introduce yourself, name, organization, and state or issue area that you're tracking this season. With that, we'll dive in and have each of our panelists introduce themselves. Autumn Richards, can you start?
Hi, everyone. I'm Autumn Richards. I'm an associate consultant here on the professional services team at Fiscal Note. I focus on all things health policy, from drug pricing and PBMs to practitioner provider scopes of practice, Medicaid, Medicare, and pretty much everything in between.
Great. Eric Sipe, can you go next?
Thanks. So I'm Eric Sipe, and I'm a consultant here at Fiscal Note, specializing in tech policy. And while I've been at Fiscal Note, I developed a strong interest in both AI legislation and data privacy legislation due to the wide range of effect it has on companies, and because of the rapid change in technology has required states to try to catch up and match that.
Great. And Logan Mears.
I'm Logan Mears. I'm an associate consultant here on our professional services team. I primarily work with clients, helping them monitor energy infrastructure and environmental policy developments.
Great. So to start off, we'll talk about defining themes. Let's hear from Eric. What should our attendees be watching for in 2026?
Yeah, so the main theme that I'm watching for is the battle between innovation versus protection. And I can't think of a better topic to demonstrate that than with AI. So at the federal level, we've seen President Trump repeatedly emphasize deregulation to spur AI innovation, with the goal of making the US the dominant power in AI. And with that, some states have taken an innovation-minded approach in 2025 that may continue into 2026. Specifically, Montana, New Hampshire, and Idaho all introduced efforts to limit burdensome AI frameworks to ensure a right to compute. Montana specifically enacted the Right to Compute Act in April, which recognized the right to own and make use of technological tools, including computational resources, and requires restrictions on those rights to be demonstrably necessary and narrowly tailored to fulfill a compelling government interest. So that's one side of the innovation part. On the other side, we have protection. We just saw this recently in the past couple of days with California enacting its foundational model law, which will require developers to share their safety plans every 3 months, forward assessments of potential risks arising from those models to the Office of Emergency Services, and then the bill also included protections for whistleblowers. And then somewhere in between, we have a balance between the two. And I think Texas provides a great example of this because they enacted a narrow version of Colorado's high-risk AI bill that had more narrow obligations for developers, gave the Attorney General exclusive enforcement rights, but it also created an AI regulatory sandbox to help promote innovation and experimentation. So in 2026, I'm watching for whether states go the innovation route, like Montana, whether they go the protection route, like California, or if they try to strike a balance like Texas did.
Great, thank you. And Logan, what is the theme that you're watching?
A theme that I'll be watching for in 2026 will be continued momentum on packaging extended producer responsibility laws. So for those that aren't familiar, packaging extended producer responsibility or EPR policies essentially assign producers responsibility for the end-of-life management of packaging materials. So this can create compliance obligations for manufacturers, including registration with authorities, reporting on packaging types and volumes, and participating in collection or recycling programs. So EPR can also influence operational processes, influence supply chain decisions and financial planning, as companies may need to track the materials that they're using, adjust packaging design, or contribute to these recycling systems. So 2025 marked major progress for packaging policy in the US, with new EPR laws enacted in Washington and Maryland, as well as study initiatives on EPR needs assessments in Hawaii and Rhode Island. And then there was some continued momentum in New York ahead of the 2026 legislative sessions. So packaging policies that we saw in 2025, in Washington, the legislature passed and the governor signed the Recycling Reform Act, establishing an EPR program for residential packaging and paper products. So this law essentially requires producers to join a producer responsibility organization, or a PRO, to fund recycling system improvements and submit plans that expand recycling access statewide. In Maryland, they enacted an EPR program for packaging through Senate Bill 901. This requires producers to register with the PRO, pay fees to cover recycling and waste management costs, as well as develop EPR plans to improve the recyclability of packaging materials. And then in Hawaii, we saw that they passed HB 750. This directs the Department of Health to conduct a statewide packaging and EPR needs assessment. So this study is due by the end of 2027 and is intended to inform future packaging policy and potential EPR legislation. Additionally, on the study front, Rhode Island lawmakers approved a bill, HB 6207. This directs a statewide recycling needs assessment and the creation of an advisory council. This replaced some earlier plans for a container deposit and packaging EPR system. So this study will evaluate the state's recycling infrastructure costs and market capacity, with findings due by 2026. So these types of studies are always kind of a precursor to later introduced more comprehensive EPR legislation. I'd also say worth watching in 2026 is the emerging policy area of microplastics. So congressional proposals that have been introduced this year include HR 4486 and S 2353. These focus on studying the human health impacts of microplastics in food and drinking water. These bills don't create regulations yet, but they signal growing federal interests that have received bipartisan sponsorship. And these bills aim to increase an understanding on the effects of microplastics, this could ultimately preview further state legislative activity. Microplastics is a topic that state legislatures have not quite delved into as much. So those interested in environmental policy should keep an eye on statehouses in 2026 for potential studies or even early action targeting microplastics and these developments that down the road could affect things like packaging and materials for manufacturers.
Great, thanks, Logan. And Autumn, let's hear your insights.
Yeah, kind of similar to Eric earlier. So in healthcare, I'll mostly be focusing on how AI is being regulated, both when it comes to clinical practice and its use on the insurance side of things. We've definitely seen a notable increase in legislation around this over the past few years, and I definitely expect this trend to continue. Since, AI is a trending topic, not just in healthcare, and it remains at the forefront of a lot of lawmakers' minds. I'm also going to be keeping a close eye on the role of private equity in healthcare. Just in the past few weeks, Governor Newsom in California actually signed a law aimed at regulating how private equity influences medical practices and providers' decision-making. And what is particularly interesting about this law is that it actually received support from both parties, which I think really does highlight that regulating private equity can be bipartisan. And we've seen similar trends emerging in other states, such as Oregon this past year. And I really expect this momentum to continue into next year. And finally, one of the other things that I'll be keeping an eye on in 2026 is how states are going to be responding to the federal budget cuts. I think we're going to see a lot of shifting priorities as they try to figure out how to respond to those funding gaps, especially when it comes to Medicaid. It's not exactly Medicaid related, but we've already seen states like New Mexico in their most recent special session pass a bill to address federal shortfalls, like the looming ACA premium tax credit expirations at the end of this year. So I really would not be surprised to see similar moves in response to the big, beautiful bill cuts.
Great. Thanks, Autumn. So moving on, are there states specifically that you guys are looking at, and which states would we think are going to demand the most attention in 2026? Is the next question. So, Logan, can you start off there?
Sure. So states to watch on the EPR front. One in particular would be New York. They had the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act. So this was Senate Bill S1464. It passed the Senate in May 2025. The bill ultimately would have created an EPR program for packaging materials and set specific recycling and reuse rates. So targets. So that was 25% by 2030 and 75% by 2052 for plastics, with comparable goals for non-plastic packaging. The proposal also included provisions for infrastructure funding and design incentives to reduce the use of non-recyclable packaging. The original version of this bill also contained provisions to remove PFAS from packaging materials. And while the measure did not ultimately advance in the assembly, there's a feeling that there's some strong interest that remains among policymakers to reintroduce this bill and try to pass a revised version in 2026. So it's something I would be paying particularly close attention to if you're following EPR. Additionally, in Connecticut, there was a bill, HB 6917. It included a study on EPR for consumer packaging, but ultimately did not pass the Senate. And its inclusion also signals a growing legislative interest in packaging EPR, even if full programs are not enacted this year. Additionally, Massachusetts has proposed packaging legislation that's actually still in the legislative process. So they have a bill that would create a producer responsibility organization to manage an alternative collection program for packaging materials, funded by producer payments into a new packaging reduction fund. Essentially just aims to shift recycling and waste management costs from municipalities onto producers, while improving recycling infrastructure, education, and performance standards.
Thanks, Logan. Autumn, we'll have you go next. Which states demand the most attention in 2026?
Yeah, so typically I like to look at states that are trendsetters, that hold a potentially large market or economic impact. Typically, laws in these states often ripple out to other parts of the country, and really keeping a close eye on their activity can give us a really good indicator into what national policy trends might look like. And a few states really do stand out. Firstly, there's California. Just by sheer population size, anything that happens here has a large market impact, and the state often plays a major role in shaping national policy conversations. And then we also have New York, which is known for introducing a lot of legislation. And even though not everything tends to pass, in New York, it does give us an early look at where policy debates might be headed. And on the healthcare side, Massachusetts is a big one to watch, because historically they've been pioneers in progressive healthcare legislation. But interestingly, for Massachusetts, they're one of the least effective legislatures in terms of actually passing bills that they introduce. On the other hand, Colorado tends to get more bills across the finish line as compared to other states. So policies that are introduced within Colorado have a greater chance of actually getting enacted.
Great. Thanks, Autumn. And Eric, what states are you looking at?
Yeah, Eric, I think I might cheat a bit on this one, but I'll be monitoring the states with existing comprehensive data privacy laws. While Massachusetts and Pennsylvania are advancing their own versions of a data privacy bill, the theme of 2025, and what I believe will continue into 2026, were states with existing data privacy protections amending their own laws. Now, broadly speaking, these fell into three main types of amendments. The first were opt-outs, where we saw Tennessee, Texas, and California introduce, and then in California's case, enact legislation to make it easier for consumers to opt out of the processing of their data. We also saw increased protections for children. Saw Virginia, Connecticut, Oregon, Montana, and a few others introduce amendments to this effect. And then finally, the third main broad type of amendment was addressing geolocation data, with Colorado, Texas, Oregon, and Minnesota all introducing legislation to add more protections for geolocation data. Now in 2026, I'll be monitoring these 19 states, potentially 21, depending on how Massachusetts and Pennsylvania play out, to see which adopt these three broad categories. Additionally, I'll be keen on Virginia. Governor Glenn Youngkin vetoed a few prominent bills this past session. First was HB 2094, which would have enacted a high-risk AI bill similar to Colorado's, but a bit more narrow. It would have covered AI systems that autonomously make or influence consequential decisions without human oversight. It made enforce obligations on developers and deployers, as well as trying to regulate generative AI. Now, in the veto statement, he stated that while he appreciated the goal of ethical AI and that it's important, it was his view that the approach would do more harm than good to Virginia's economy. He stated that the bill would harm the creation of new jobs and the attraction of new business investment and the availability of innovative technology. So it kind of goes back to that theme of innovation versus protection. And they also stated that the rigid framework does not account for the rapidly evolving and fast-moving nature of the AI industry. It would put too much burdens on smaller firms and startups. Now, if Abigail Spanberger is elected governor, I think it increases the odds that if this bill were to be reintroduced and passed by the state legislature, that it would be enacted. She has supported other AI bills in Congress, specifically the AI Plant Act, which was introduced in 2024, which would require the U.S. Department of Treasury, Commerce, and Homeland Security to develop a plan to combat nefarious artificial intelligence uses. This included using current enforcement tools to combat fraud, financial crime, and AI-generated information, and implementing new cross-jurisdictional techniques to defend against these attacks, as well as promoting innovation. The second bill that Governor Glenn Youngkin vetoed pertained to data center developers, which required them to conduct site assessments, examining sound volume within 500 feet of schools and residences, as well as measuring the potential effects on groundwater and natural resources. Again, in his veto statement, Youngkin stated that local governments, not the General Assembly, should be making such decisions. He also cited the amount of money and jobs that data centers provide Virginia, saying that no Virginia law should allow other states to surpass Virginia as the data center capital of the world. Again, if Abigail Spanberger is elected, she has stated that she wants data centers to pay their own way and their fair share of electricity costs. So it's highly likely that if she is elected, we do see some more stringent data center laws and the potential introduction of a high-risk AI bill. And then finally, California, as Autumn said, it has the most population. And in regards to tech policy, it has Silicon Valley and is a constant innovator for AI legislation and technology innovation. But Governor Newsom has developed a pattern being a bit reluctant to impose sweeping restrictions, especially on the developing AI industry in the state. We saw this last year with SB 1047, which Newsom vetoed, but then we saw this past year a more precise version of that bill in SB 53 being signed into law. So looking at a couple of the bills this year that Newsom vetoed, we saw AB 1064, which is a different chatbot bill than I'll discuss later. This would have prohibited companies from letting children use chatbots capable of sexually explicit interactions or encouraging a child to contemplate self-harm. Now, he stated that in his veto, this bill would impose such broad restrictions on use of conversational AI tools that may lead to a total ban on the use of these products for minors. And we see this sentiment of an overly broad bill being echoed for SB 7, which would require employers to disclose whenever they use an automated decision-making system in employment-related decisions. So California will be one that I'm watching to see if these bills are reintroduced as narrower versions in 2026.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Moving on to our next question, and we've touched on specific pieces of policy throughout this entire webinar, but wanted to kind of reiterate and talk about specific pieces policy from a state that you feel could have significant impacts. So we'll first go to Autumn.
Yeah, so I think Colorado and Washington passing mini Hart-Scott-Rodino acts could definitely have some significant impacts. These states typically title them something along the line of Uniform Antitrust Pre-Merger Notification Acts. And we've seen other states introduce similar bills as well. And more specifically, what these bills are going to be doing is requiring anyone filing a pre-merger notification to simultaneously provide a completed electronic copy of the Hart-Scott-Rodino form to the Attorney General of that state. So on the surface, it really is about increasing reporting requirements and giving the state more oversight into mergers. But it also means that, the state can play a bigger role in antitrust conversations and have a stronger ability to challenge any mergers. And we can definitely expect to see other states follow in Colorado and Washington's footsteps. So I really do expect these bills to have a long-lasting impact and going into 2026.
Thanks, Autumn. Next, we'll go to Eric.
Yeah, so I'm monitoring Colorado and the attempts to amend their high-risk AI bill. So we saw that there's a special session in just a couple months ago in which there were attempts to amend it. Now, in this special session, 4 bills were introduced. One was introduced, SB 4, by the Democratic lawmakers who ran the 2024 bill to try to narrow it, with a specific focus on disclosure for developers of AI systems and in trying to shift the burden from deployers over to developers. We also saw another competing bill, HB 8, which was seen as the additional bill that had the potential to be passed, as it was introduced with bipartisan support. This one clarified that existing state statutes around civil rights laws and consumer protections would also apply to AI. It would empower the Attorney General to sue a developer or a deployer that uses AI in a way that violates the Colorado Consumer Protection Act. And it would allow an individual to file a complaint against an AI developer if the system violates the state's anti-discrimination law. Now we saw 2 Republican bills, which are less likely to pass. However, one that I will be monitoring is HB 9, as this narrows the definition of consequential decision only to include those decisions related to employment or public safety. And this bill would also exempt businesses with fewer than 250 employees and businesses with less than $5 million in annual revenue, as well as local governments. Now, I say I'm monitoring this because the representative who introduced this, Representative Ron Weinberg, he actually asked members to vote against it because he did not have the time he needed to refine the language of the standard that Colorado small businesses deserve. So with a whole legislative session ahead of him, I anticipate that he will have the time to begin to refine the language and sat more Republican support, which could harm the bipartisan bill HB 8, as the Republican sponsors for that bill may favor the one introduced by Representative Ron Weinberg. And then finally, we saw SB 8, which would repeal the entire law and update the state's anti-discrimination laws to prohibit discrimination using any technology. Now, going forward into 2026, I anticipate that the 2 bills that will be most significant were the ones introduced by Democratic lawmakers. Now, during the special session, we saw attempts to try to come to a compromise in this. negotiations, it really didn't go anywhere. And instead, what we got was an extension of the effective date of the bill. In 2026, I anticipate it will be a bit more challenging still to try to come to a compromise, but I would anticipate it being somewhere between SB 4 and HB 8.
Thanks, Eric. And we'll finish up with Logan.
Sure. So, um, policies that I'd be paying particular attention to would maybe be in New Jersey on the EPR front. They had introduced a bill mandating that packaging materials be recyclable or compostable by 2034. So the bill also proposed a $120 million fund from fees on manufacturers to boost recycling efforts. The bill ultimately did not pass, but did receive significant support from various environmental groups. In Illinois, in April, the Illinois State Senate passed SB 1531, which would have prohibited the use of disposable food service in containers starting in 2030. The bill expanded on previously enacted legislation affecting public agencies and universities. However, it did not pass the House before the legislative session ended. Also on the regulatory front, we're also going to begin to see promulgated rules in Maryland and Washington on their newly enacted EPR laws that were passed this past session.
Thanks, Logan. So before we go to audience Q&A, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to put themselves in the shoes of our attendees and let us know what's going to keep you up at night come 2026. What are you anticipating happening, and what are you going to be doing to get ahead of it? So we're going to go back to Logan on this one to start.
Sure. So to stay ahead in 2026 on the influx of potential EPR, microplastics, and other environmental legislation that we're going to see across multiple states, a helpful strategy is obviously monitoring pre-filing periods. So knowing when they are open and tracking what's coming before January gets here. So in states like Hawaii, they will open pre-filing on November 15th. New York begins November 15th as well. Virginia begins pre-filing November 17th, and Maryland on November 20th. So pre-filing begins soon. Using tools like Policy Note to flag pre-filed bills can help ensure that nothing helps slip through the cracks. And these pre-files really start to paint the picture of what the 2026 legislative landscape will look like, what themes are emerging, where policy trends are headed, and which states move next on EPR and other environmental stewardship policy. Another smart move is to look closely at states that already have policy on EPR packaging. So these are California, Oregon, Colorado, Minnesota, Maine, Washington, and Maryland. And these programs tend to share similar requirements for producers, such as registration, reporting, and producer responsibility organization participation. And reviewing how those laws are structured can give you a good preview of what new proposals will look like elsewhere in 2026.
Thanks, Logan. Autumn, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, I guess what really keeps me up at night, and I think all state policy folks can kind of relate to this, is just generally the sheer volume of legislation that's going to be introduced. It can be really overwhelming when you're not organized and planning ahead. That's why staying on top of it early is just so critical. Kind of going along with Logan's point, like staying on top of pre-filing is really helpful. You really do not want to be playing catch up on legislation that could potentially increase compliance requirements on your business or organization, or potentially miss those introduced requirements altogether. Regarding the second part of your question, Eric, I really anticipate that states will continue to take a bigger role in shaping healthcare in the absence of federal reforms. So everything from drug pricing and PBM reform to price transparency, all really aimed at making healthcare more accessible and affordable for patients. So there's really going to be a lot to watch and understand going into 2026. And to really get ahead of state sessions, it really comes down to a few different things. First, prioritization. you really need to focus on the key states where your organization operates or on the states that could have the most impact on your patients, customers, or your stakeholders. Secondly, staying on top of your core policy issues with bill tracking and analysis, which we provide at Fiscal Note, while being flexible enough to adapt as the legislative landscape shifts. We can never, ever really predict what legislators are going to do, but we can utilize our tools in staying on top of current conversations and sentiments. And third and finally, identifying your key partners early, whether that's legislative stakeholders or like-minded advocacy organizations. So you can really collaborate with those and amplify your impact from the very beginning of sessions.
Thanks, Autumn. So Eric, let you bring it up.
Yeah, so what really keeps me up at night is the volume, but really it is about how rapidly the technology is changing with AI and how data privacy concerns continually pop up and they're always evolving. My question is, how do states address this? And I think it also keeps state legislators up at night as well. And I think one way they do anticipate some of these changes and that they do address this is by checking the news, which I would recommend everyone else doing as well. It's broad and it is something that's very easy to do because you can identify potential areas where legislators may target specific AI uses or data privacy uses. I think the perfect example is last year we saw the increasing number of stories of people, especially teenagers, committing self-harm after sharing their feelings or plans with a chatbot, and that chatbot not intervening. And in response, we saw New York try to address the use of chatbots by applying a law more generally to companion chatbots, requiring AI companies to disclose and continually remind users that they're not interacting with a human and that they must detect that if a user is expressing thoughts of self-harm, to direct them to crisis services. Likewise, we saw California pass another similar law that would be a bit closer to New York's to require chatbots to periodically notify users that they're not human and maintain specific protocols to prevent the model from outputting self-harm ideation related content. So I would recommend checking the news because legislators will be salient and very aware of very catchy news stories that involve AI and data privacy, and then tailor legislation to address that. And Eric, if it's all right, because it kind of does play off my answer, I'd like to address Alex's question in the chat.
Go for it.
Yeah, Alex. So I think the story of algorithmic pricing and dynamic pricing and digital coupon ban bills is an interesting one. We saw in the news Delta received a lot of blowback for trying to shift to a more dynamic pricing model. And in 2025, we saw a few states, but not many, try to address this. New York did by introducing the Preventing Algorithmic Pricing Discrimination Act, as well as targeting specific areas like food service or rental. California had some momentum to enacting the Preventing Algorithmic Price Fixing Act, which prohibited use, sale, or licensing of price-setting algorithms when they're intended to be used by competitors to set prices or supply levels based on non-public data. That passed the first chamber, but all momentum stopped for it. So I anticipate that as people become more aware of the use of AI in dynamic pricing, more news stories will come out. It'll become more of a bigger story for legislators, as well as for the public to begin to advocate for more restrictions on the use of dynamic pricing. So I anticipate that this will become a bigger issue in 2026, with California potentially leading the way on this.
Great, thanks, Eric. So that wraps up the main portion. We're going to move on to Q&A. At the start, we've had a couple of questions on whether this is going to be recorded and emailed out. We are recording this webinar and it will be shared out afterwards, as well as with the inclusion of some resources. So the first question that we got, I'm going to go, Autumn, we have two here for healthcare related stuff. So I'm going to start with you. Autumn, what are your thoughts on major insurers backing out of the Medicare Advantage plans? And then also, do you see Make America Healthy Again activity at the federal level trickling down to the states? If so, what states would you pay closest attention to on specific Make America Healthy Again issues, identified issues?
So going to that first question about Medicare Advantage plans, yes, we have seen going into 2026 with open enrollment starting for Medicare, plans such as Aetna, United Health, they're cutting back on the amount of plans that they're offering throughout the country. This is primarily kind of related to the cost of healthcare and the fact that these insurers do not see that these plans are making them money. So this is just a response into that, and also with kind of the cut back in reimbursement rates for those services under those health plans have kind of contributed to these insurers making this decision. I think the only way to bring back those plans or have Aetna, United Health, Humana, start offering more plans for seniors is kind of getting to the root cause related to reimbursement rates and like dealing with the cost issues. I think that's the only way. But until then, seniors definitely need to be made aware that they might not have access to their current plans that they were on. Their premiums might increase to some degree if they have to change plans. They need to make sure that their drugs are being covered under their new plans, and all the services that they need. So there definitely needs to be some effort on if you're dealing with patients, there needs to be some effort for on you to make sure that your patients are aware of these changes and that they are able to adapt and do what they need to do for their own health. Um, and going to the MAHA question, I don't know if I've seen anything in particular come down at the state level relating to MAHA, but if I had to like predict what could happen is I think the first thing that would probably happen is related to vaccines and probably like vaccine mandates with around the country, within different states. And if I had to guess a state or guess a couple of states that would probably go along with these policies are I would probably set my sights on Florida, some of the other Republican states. Texas isn't going to be in session in 2026, so we won't see anything from them. But I think it would mostly be related to vaccines if I had to guess.
Great. Thanks, Autumn. So next we're going to go to Logan. There are two questions here for you. I'll let you answer. I'll ask them both and then have you answer them both. The first one, do you know if lithium battery technology and products fall into any of the EPR conversation, specifically around recycling? Not necessarily packaging, but rather the actual batteries and their components. And then the other one, there have been a couple of questions related to PFAS and movement regarding PFAS regulations. Someone was saying that Andrew here was saying that there seem to be less PFAS bills addressing consumer products this year and a steady stream of bills addressing MCLs, but still less. I'll let you answer those in turn.
So on the lithium battery technology front, these products do fall squarely within the current EPR conversation, I guess, but specifically from the standpoint of the batteries themselves and their components, rather than packaging. So state battery EPR laws are increasingly requiring producers to take responsibility for the full life cycle of the lithium ion batteries. So that includes the like collection or transportation, recycling, and ultimately the safe disposal of these batteries. And these laws are largely driven by safety and environmental concerns since lithium ion batteries can pose fire risks if they're improperly discarded. So there's legislation that's already been enacted that's out there, including in Vermont in 2024, they passed H7584. I believe Washington, D.C. has legislation on this topic, as well as California, Washington, and Illinois. essentially making producers responsible for the end-of-life management of batteries. And the scope kind of can differ by state, but the focus is consistently on the batteries and their components, like the cathodes and metals, rather than the products, the packaging that house them. Let's see. Let me try to get into the PFAS question here.
I think to start, it's just kind of
Okay.
general movement regarding PFAS regulations. And then there was a second
Okay.
question posited by Andrew talking about addressing consumer, sorry, a steady stream of bills addressing MCLs, I think was kind of where he wanted to focus.
Sure. So on this, I'll start with the second one and move back to the first. But on the second question, I think in 2026 we're gonna actually see more PFAS legislation on consumer products. This given to the fact that the EPA has pulled back on PFAS regulation. So states may step in to fill that gap a little bit. So you'd expect, PFAS legislative activity to pick up in 2026. In 2025, there were bills introduced, I think, in over 39 states addressing consumer products, firefighting foam, water quality remediation, and emissions of PFAS. So with the federal government stepping back, states are likely to continue leading on PFAS regulation, making it one of the more active kind of environmental policies of this year. To answer the second part of states to watch out for, I think one in particular would be California. There was a lot of movement on the PFAS legislation that was enacted, especially toward the end of their session, where the policy was dialed back to only address, I think, 6 specific consumer products like cookware and ski wax, for example. And I think this year, California, New York, Massachusetts may be states to keep an eye on for broader action on PFAS and see if they may take it a step further, given that the federal government is kind of taking a step back.
Great, thanks, Logan. So we have another question from Elizabeth. Any thoughts on ongoing DEI issues, public benefits, or public safety? Eric, I'm going to kick that one over to you because I think you have some experience with this.
Yeah, so the one thing that I'm looking out for is how do states respond to President Trump's executive order of preventing woke AI in the federal government? Now, this executive order requires agencies to procure large language models that prioritize truthfulness and ideological neutrality. They must avoid partisan or ideological bias, including the promotion of concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, to implement this, the OMB is going to issue guidance within 120 days outlining how agencies and vendors should comply. My concern here is the broadness of the language and the lack of definition, which hopefully the OMB will provide more guidance on, but is not guaranteed. So what I'm watching out for is whether states mimic this language and kind of enact these broad either legislation or executive orders that prohibit the procurement of AI that promotes DEI, whether they extend it more broadly to just preventing ideological bias in AI LLMs, rather than just those procured by the government, or if they try to narrow this language down a bit more to more specifically define what ideological bias is, what is partisanship, what is DEI specifically. So that's one thing that I'll be watching in 2026 is to see whether, and I anticipate Republican states will be introducing this kind of bills or executive orders, whether Republican states will copy the language, expand upon it, or make it more narrow so that it is better defined and easier to comply with.
Thanks, Eric. Autumn, we have 2 questions for you. First one, do you think we'll see more bills promoting PBMs, prohibiting PBMs from owning pharmacies? The example is Arkansas HB 1150 from last year. And the other one, I'm curious to hear more on state responses to changes in Medicaid from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Is there a trend you think states, excuse me, is there a trend where you think states will go? And what are you watching on this front?
Yeah, so to your first question about PBMs owning pharmacies or prohibitions on PBM and PBMs owning pharmacies, 100% we are going to see more bills introduced that are going to include those provisions. PBM bills, out of all of the bills that I've seen around the country relating to healthcare, they are it is one of those types of topics that states love copying each other on. When it comes to PBMs, they will use the exact same provisions, the exact same language, sometimes the exact same bills between states. So I would put money on states introducing PBM bills that prohibit PBMs from owning pharmacies. These would probably be included in those larger package PBM reform bills that we've seen a lot more of over the past couple of years, rather than one-off provision bills that I like to call. So definitely expect to see those, especially with that Arkansas bill from this past session. Relating or going to the question about Medicaid from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, I mean, states are gonna have to respond to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act because it is gonna be implementing a lot more requirements, especially on work requirement fronts. States are gonna have to increase their administrative requirements to make sure people are qualifying for Medicaid, and able to take in all of that administrative work regarding like requirements and filing and all of that stuff. So I think states are going to have to raise, in that sense, some state funding to be able to comply with those measures, while also like having to cut back or losing a lot of federal funding for Medicaid. So a lot of their folks within their states are going to lose access to Medicaid, but also have more requirements on the states. If I had to say a trend that states would go, and which states I would watch out for on this front, I don't know if I have a trend at this point. I will be curious to see how they start to deal with these issues come 2026, especially how they're going to implement their administrative changes that they'll need to make. So yeah.
Thanks, Autumn. All right, and then Logan, we have two questions for you. First one, are there any packaging trends or bills that you're tracking that are not focused on EPR, so things that are kind of outside of that? And then the second one, in states like Texas, where we saw a bill which requires packaged foods to display warning labels for certain additives by 2027, will other states implement similar policies, and what states might implement those policies?
Sorry to unmute myself. I'm not familiar at the moment with any packaging trends or bills that are not EPR. Some of the congressional activity mentioned earlier on microplastics, I think, are things that definitely be paying attention to, because those have bipartisan support in Congress. So not necessarily state legislation, but things to maybe keep an eye on, as they're going to be tangential to packaging. I'm trying to read the other in states like Texas. Um, Candidly, I'm not quite as familiar with um, food packaging, so I can't provide a real educated answer on that at the moment. But it could be something you could expect to see. I would be something I'd have to look into further.
Thanks, Logan. Okay, so I will actually touch on, we had a question about early childhood education. So as more states attempt to meet workforce demands, like early childhood education teacher workforce shortages, which states should we keep an eye on for ECE credentialing bills and regulations? The short answer here is that it's a broad swath. There's quite a few states that are really pushing for this. I do have some education clients in my portfolio, and we take a broad approach. We're seeing a lot when it comes to either incentives to help in the kind of credentialing process, whether that's educational credits, opening it up to credential swapping, so it's not necessarily time in training, but there's like work credits. If you've been working at a early childhood education place, you're provided extra credentials or credits towards that. And then as well as like just kind of like funding generally and subsidies for supporting people that are going to be doing a handful of job training or workforce training to include early child education. So I would say for that one, I would keep it fairly broad when it comes to which states we're focusing on, but it's a lot of incentives that these states are focusing on to kind of boost entrance into that industry. And then last one, looking at this, Logan. So this one, are you seeing backlash on EPR programs regarding their governance, whether it's constitutional or over the developments for like fee formulas, enforcement, or deadlines?
Sure. I think we're seeing some activity on this right now in Maine. There was a bill that passed that kind of took a revisit of the original EPR legislation that was passed in 2021. So that was Maine LD 1541. They are currently in a public comment period on amendments to update the stewardship program for packaging. That actually ends on October 26th of 2025. So there's definitely, a bit of backlash, I would maybe say, on a few states as far as once these enacted bills get into the regulatory process. There's been a little bit of room for amending the programs and making sure they're actually feasible to be implemented. And then kind of on that same foot, with Washington and Maryland, at the moment, there's very limited kind of regulatory guidance or any types of comment periods that are have not yet been announced on promulgating proposed rules. So definitely room to like kind of get involved in the proposed rulemaking process there, and something to keep an eye on the rest of 2025 and early 2026.
Perfect. Thanks, Logan. Are there any additional questions here? Anybody has, they can put into the chat. I'll give it another second. All right. If there are no other questions, this has been a really great conversation. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their time and willingness to share, to everyone here live with us today, as well as everyone that's going to be here on replay. Thank you for watching. We thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.